The FAA's air traffic controllers rely on 138 systems that monitor weather, conduct navigation and surveillance, and manage communications. More than half of these systems are older than 20 years. Some are more than 60 years old. Worryingly, FAA's assessment showed that 58 of the systems with shortages or shortfalls have a critical operational impact. Amongst them, we identified 17 that we felt were especially concerning given their age, sustainability, and operational impact. Of those, the earliest of those 17 modernizations is planned to finish in 6 years. Some are planned to be completed in 10 to 13 years, and 4 do not have ongoing modernization efforts.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 310th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. On January 29th, 2025, just before 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a Black Hawk military helicopter crashed into an American Airlines regional flight carrying 64 people, just seconds before that plane was expected to safely land on the runway at Reagan Washington National Airport, which is the closest airport to Washington, D.C. No one survived the crash, and so including the 3 military members who died on board the military helicopter, the total death toll is 67 people. Now, before we get into this episode, because you're going to hear some things today that are just probably not going to make you feel great about flying within the United States, I do think it is very important to tell you that flying is still the safest way to travel in the United States, even after this disaster. As shocking as 67 deaths are in the United States, we average about 110 deaths every single day on our nation's roads. It remains true that the most dangerous part of your airplane travel day remains the drive to and from the airport. But 67 deaths all at once in an airline accident gets this much attention for a good reason. With the distributed nature of airplane travel, when you hear about these crashes, you just don't know who might be on those planes. So like when a car crashes in Arkansas, I'm generally not too worried about my loved ones, personally, because I don't know anyone in Arkansas. But when a flight from Wichita, Kansas, where I know no one, to Washington, D.C., where I only know a few people, you still have to wonder, because you just never know who's on that plane. People in Russia wouldn't have expected Russians to be on that plane, and yet they were on it. Figure skating fans who have been cheering on kids who live and train in Boston wouldn't expect that those kids that they cheer for to have been on that plane, and yet. And my husband didn't expect a fellow employee at his company to be on that plane with his figure skater son, and yet. Every plane crash summons a fear in us for our loved ones, no matter where they live, because you just never know where they are on that day. And this plane crash, even though my husband had never met his fellow employee or his son who died, this one hits close enough to home to have me absolutely enraged. Because pilots, air traffic controllers, aviation researchers, so many experts have been waving red flags at every decision maker in government, and that certainly includes our members of Congress, for a long time. This accident feels almost inevitable, although it was just pure awful luck that it happened to that plane and those people. The truth is, it could have been any of our planes. And had it happened just a week earlier at that same exact airport, it could have happened to me. And that airport, Reagan National, it's especially infuriating to me as the host of Congressional Dish that this happened at that particular airport, because the Congress that just ended, the Congress that I branded as the worst Congress I'd ever seen, well, they made this more likely at that airport with a selfish and short-sighted provision that they slipped into the FAA reauthorization last spring. So I'm angry. Just because driving is so much more dangerous, that does not mean that we should accept the clearly identified and preventable dangers that exist in our air travel system. And I'm guessing I'm not alone in that opinion or in my anger. But instead of just eating this anger, or letting this anger eat away at me, I'm choosing to do something about it. which is to tell you more about the big picture, the systemic problems that Congress knows damn well exist, which you can channel your anger into demanding that they fix. If you're going to lash out at anyone, it seems appropriate that it should be your member of Congress. But if you're going to take the time to contact them, your time and effort will be much more effective if you can be specific about what you want them to do. And so today I'm going to give you enough information so that you can take your pick and use that specific information however you will. But real quick, I do have to remind you that this show is listener supported. And if you are tired of hearing me say that, please support the show on Patreon, where we have a completely separate feed. In that separate feed, you get all of these episodes, except these episodes have these pitches for funding removed, and we remove all of the golf swing sensors, which allow this show to be suitable in classrooms. There's also some bonus episodes now, including the series that I have started called Last Week in Congress, where I'm letting you know what Congress did last week. And so if you want access to those episodes, please go to Congressional Dish's Patreon and sign up for approximately $5 per episode, but you can set the amount. And if you just want to support this show, we still really love and appreciate your Venmos, your Zells, your Bitcoin, your Chipotle gift cards, anything else you want to send. But this is a listener-supported show, which is why you're not going to hear any ads today, and why I can tell you things that the corporate world doesn't want you to know. Okay. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's look at what is going on in our air traffic system here in the United States. Like I said before, this crash felt kind of inevitable. Reagan Washington National Airport in Arlington, Virginia, where the crash happened, had at least 2 close calls just last year. In April 2024, a plane operated by Southwest Airlines nearly crossed the same runway that a JetBlue flight was using to take off. And then just a month later, an American Airlines jet almost crashed with a small airplane. Those near misses were among the 1,757 so-called runway incursions that have been documented by the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, in 2024. But Reagan Washington National Airport is well known to be particularly risky because the airspace around it is very complex and heavily trafficked. And that's because the airport's 3 runways are among the busiest in the country, and because of the location of this airport. I am not exaggerating when I say that it is next door to the Pentagon. Because while the zip code for Reagan Washington National Airport is technically in the state of Virginia, in reality, this airport is in Washington, D.C. When I know that I'm going to be landing there, I like to sit on the right side of the airplane because in most circumstances, that's how you get the view of the Capitol and the Washington Monument and every other site in Washington, D.C. It's spectacular when you land there at night. But it's that close. And that's why members of Congress want to fly home every weekend out of Reagan instead of Dulles International, which is an additional 30 miles or so further away from the Capitol. Members of Congress know this airport well, and they know damn well how crowded its airspace is because it's that close to the airport and close to every other big shots helipad in Washington, D.C. I swear to God, every single time I've landed at Reagan, I've noticed helicopters flying nearby. And I don't even go there all that regularly. And so if I've noticed how many flying machines are in the skies over D.C., members of Congress certainly must have as well. But despite that obvious reality and the warnings that were given against this idea, Congress increased the number of flights allowed into and out of Reagan Washington National Airport, authorizing 5 more flights to enter the already too busy airport via Dingleberry onto the FAA reauthorization that became law in May. And this was possible because Reagan is one of only 2 airports in the country owned by the federal government, giving Congress unique authority over its operations. But before the bill was a dingleberry, it was a standalone bill. And so we have the names of who we can blame. And the bill's author, who's still in Congress, is Representative Burgess Owens of Utah. And while we don't know for sure his motivations for increasing the number of flights at an already too crowded airport, we do know that Burgess Owens of Utah took many thousands of dollars from people affiliated with Delta Airlines, which lobbied for the bill not only with legal bribes to politicians and traditional lobbyists, but Delta also sent almost 3 dozen Delta frontline employees on a trip to Capitol Hill, which they called a fly-in, in June 2023 to pressure Congress to allow more flights to land at Reagan. But I've got to tell you, Delta wasn't alone in that effort, even though their efforts were a lot. Delta was joined by more than 60 other companies in lobbying Congress to make the Reagan runways even more crowded. And in Congress, while Republican Burgess Owens was the main sponsor of that bill, this was a bipartisan effort. So like Democrat Hank Johnson of Georgia, he was also a co-sponsor on the bill, and he has also taken tens of thousands of dollars in legal bribes, at least from people affiliated with Delta and other airline front groups. But I do have to tell you that there was plenty of opposition to this idea from other members of Congress in both parties who are less short-sighted than Owens and Johnson. In fact, when voted on as a standalone bill, the idea of expanding the number of flights at Reagan was voted down 205 to 229. Now, for what it's worth, most of the Republicans said yes to increasing the number of flights, and most Democrats said no. But I think the overall point here is that Congress was heard, or at least the House of Representatives was heard on this idea, and the answer was no. But then it became law less than a year later as a dingleberry on the 410-page FAA reauthorization law. And the additional flights were added at Reagan National last month, just weeks before the crash. And so what that means is that the people who are in charge of managing traffic into Reagan Washington National Airport had to then manage more traffic. But there's a problem there, because our air traffic controllers, who are the ones that do that management, they have been short-staffed for a very long time. And this is something that Congress has been aware of for a very long time. And so here's the situation as it was on the day of the crash. This is Nick Daniels. He's the president of the National Air Traffic Controller Association. And in this clip, he was speaking to the reporter on CBS this morning. This aired on January 31st.
Right now, we have a controller shortage in this nation. 10,800 certified controllers are out there doing this job day in, day out, where there should be 14,335.
And on the night of the crash, we know that the ideal and normal staffing in the air traffic control tower would have been one controller focused on helicopter traffic and one focused on the commercial planes. But that is not what happened. Instead, both of those responsibilities were being done by one person on Wednesday night, according to a report by the Federal Aviation Administration obtained by the Associated Press. And this was a situation which the report said is, quote, not normal, unquote. Which means that it's possible that the shortage of air traffic controllers may have played a role in the crash. Now, as you heard Nick Daniels say, Nick Daniels was again the president of the National Air Traffic Controller Association. He said that in order to be fully staffed, we need 14,335 air traffic controllers. And that's pretty close to the number recommended in 2023 by the Collaborative Resource Work Group, CRWG, which is a combination of FAA personnel and people from the National Air Traffic Controller Association. But right now, it's unclear and actually seems unlikely that that number is what's being aimed for by the hiring managers at the FAA. And that's because the FAA has been using a different model developed by its Office of Finance and Management, which determines staffing targets based on historical data. And the problem with that seems pretty obvious to me, because if we are increasing the number of planes and passengers in this country, which we are, but are staffing air traffic control based on historical data, that means that the staffing is being determined based on times that had fewer planes in the air than we have now. So using historical data seems like a recipe for short staffing, which is exactly why air traffic controllers are fighting with the FAA to change the model that they use to determine air traffic controller staffing. They don't want the model that was created by the finance people. They want the model that they helped create via the CRWG, or Collaborative Resource Work Group. And I know this because just a little over a month ago, on December 12th, this was one of the many red flags waved in our senators' faces at a hearing in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the Subcommittee on Aviation Safety, Operations, and Innovation. Here's Dean Icapelli, who is a co-worker of Nick Daniels. He serves as his chief of staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
But it has been a challenge convincing the FAA as a whole that the CRWG numbers are the correct number, that we need to adequately and safely staff the air traffic control facilities in the country, allow them to take sufficient breaks, that allow us to participate in the modernization efforts and moving the air traffic control system into the future. We are expecting that the part of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024, again, thank you all for passing that, requires a study of the two different models.
But I feel like ordering a study isn't good enough. If the air traffic controllers say their staffing goals are off because of the FAA model that is developed by finance guys, if they're saying that model is fucked, then Congress should have just told the FAA to use the other model, the one developed in partnership with the air traffic controllers who have to do the actual work. And so ordering a study seems like a brush off to me. But of course, the National Air Traffic Controller Association representatives need to be polite to our senatorial snowflakes, especially to their faces. But to their credit in Congress did do something that will genuinely help this situation in the FAA reauthorization, which again became law in May of 2024, which is that reauthorization is going to require maximum staffing of air traffic controllers. Specifically, what it says in the law is that, quote, for each of the fiscal years 2024 through 2028, the FAA administrator shall, no options, shall, set as the minimum hiring target for new air traffic controllers at the maximum number of individuals able to be trained at the Federal Aviation Administration Academy. And in 2024, that apparently went very well. So here's Dean Acapelli again, the Chief of Staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
We need to continue to focus on hiring. We know that the FAA has just met their hiring goal for the fiscal year, and so we're in a new fiscal year. And we, based on the FAA Reauthorization Act, that they're required to do max hiring, and we have partnered with the FAA, I should say, and our public affairs departments to go out and promote that. If you ever scroll through Facebook, you see hundreds of air traffic controllers promoting this profession and how great it is and how much they want people to get in it for two reasons. One, it is a great profession, and two, we need more air traffic controllers.
So that's good news. But even those hires are not really helping with the air traffic controller shortage just yet. Because last year, the FAA hired 1,811 air traffic controllers, the maximum number they're able to train. But that training generally takes 2 years, and so those people are not fully up and running yet and probably won't be for another year. And even with those hires, and even by the outdated standards that we think the FAA are using, we are still short about 1,200 air traffic controller employees. And that's without a single air traffic controller retiring, which by FAA regulation, they're forced to do at just age 56. Which brings me to the trump of it all. Because upon taking office 9 days before the crash, Donald Trump enacted a government-wide hiring freeze. But there were some exemptions, and so the Department of Transportation said that air traffic controllers are exempt from Trump's hiring freeze, so that's good. But there was a letter that was sent out by the Office of Management and Budget on the day before the crash, encouraging federal employees, including air traffic controllers, to consider resigning in return for full pay and benefits through September 30th. And this letter told them that they had 8 days to make a decision, which is obviously not helpful when we're trying to increase staffing at air traffic control. But the truth is that the problems with our air traffic control system go far beyond staffing, which Congress is well aware of, but based on the national conversation in the last few days, it's clear that our nation is not. And so let's get back to Dean Acapelli, the Chief of Staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
The FAA operates more than 300 air traffic control facilities. The FAA's 21 air route traffic control centers were built in the 1960s and have an average age of 62 years old. Fort Worth, Seattle, Kansas City, Chicago, and Houston centers are each between 59 and 64 years old. Our terminal facilities also require attention. The average FAA-operated tower is 36 years old. For example, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport has 3 air traffic control towers, which service one of the busiest airports in the country, the oldest of which is 50 years old. Many FAA facilities have exceeded their expected life cycles. Others require new roofs, windows, HVAC systems, plumbing, and elevators. When major systems fail or facilities have structural problems, it can lead to flight delays or temporary airspace shutdowns. It is implausible to build the air traffic control system of the future in outdated and inadequate buildings. The National Airspace System needs and deserves the best facilities and equipment to move this nation's passengers and cargoes, to sustain many of our legacy systems, as well as to enhance and deploy new safety and modernization programs. The FAA projects that it will need $6 billion annually for its facilities and equipment account, which is a significant increase compared to recent years. Without this funding, along with continued focus on air traffic controller staffing, the FAA will struggle to maintain its capacity of the system, let alone modernize or expand it for new users and emerging technologies.
And now here's Kevin Walsh, the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the independent, nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, which does investigations for Congress, and which had just released a damning report on the day of the hearing, which I put in the show notes for you, titled, quote, "Urgent FAA actions are needed to modernize aging systems," unquote.
The FAA's air traffic controllers rely on 138 systems that monitor weather, conduct navigation and surveillance, and manage communications. More than half of these systems are older than 20 years. Some are more than 60 years old. To its credit, the FAA reviewed the systems to gauge how easy they are to maintain, as well as the operational impact of those systems. The FAA expects to use this assessment going forward to prioritize its modernization efforts. That assessment found that 33 of the air traffic control systems, 24%, had adequate funding and spare parts. The remaining 105 had differing degrees of shortages or potential shortages in spares and funding. Many of them also had limited staff expertise and did not meet mission needs. Worryingly, FAA's assessment showed that 58 of the systems with shortages or shortfalls have a critical operational impact. Amongst them, we identified 17 that we felt were especially concerning given their age, sustainability, and operational impact. Of those, the earliest of those 17 modernizations is planned to finish in 6 years. Some are planned to be completed in 10 to 13 years, and 4 do not have ongoing modernization efforts.
And so how are the people who have to work with these systems that are literally so old that we don't have the parts for them anymore able to do their jobs? Well, Congress got the answer to that. Here's Dave Sparrow, the National President of Professional Aviation Safety Specialists at the AFL-CIO. And so his division is nicknamed PASS. And this is a labor union that represents FAA employees, including safety inspectors, technicians, engineers, and others whose jobs it is to maintain and upgrade air traffic control systems and other aviation infrastructure.
I'll start out by saying I like the way Captain Ambrosi talked about workarounds. That is essentially what our folks do every day when they don't have spare parts. They find ways to make these systems work. They look for the spare parts. They have to dig into the FAA system to see if they can get them refurbished. It will become more difficult as time goes on. Moving forward, they have to have the ability and the training, the staffing as well. We've had incidents in various places where we have the equipment, we have the spare parts, yet we don't have the right people in the right place at the right time to restore systems. In Chicago earlier this year, we had a ground stop because we did not have a trained technician available on shift to be able to exclude a software problem that effectively caused the controllers to not know where the aircraft were. Once that person came in, they fixed it in 2 minutes. But all of these things fall together. It's going to become more difficult as time goes on. We have to have the personnel, we have to have the parts, we have to have the training. It breaks our members' hearts to not be able to sustain the air traffic control system the way they want to.
Now, obviously, with that many systems, about 76% of them apparently disintegrating and becoming obsolete, there's going to have to be a prioritization of which systems need to be addressed first. And so here's the biggest red flag waved by Dean Acapelli, who's the Chief of Staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
Currently, one of the highest priorities for the FAA is to address the outdated FAA telecommunications infrastructure network known as FTI. The FTI network affects radar displays that depict air traffic in real time and air-to-ground frequencies used to communicate with pilots. The network is largely comprised of copper wiring, which can no longer reliably meet the demand of the National Airspace System. Recently, ground stops at airports in the New York City and Washington, D.C. areas highlight the consequences of a failure of the FTI network. The FAA must transition 4,600 sites away from copper wire and onto fiber optic network to avoid extensive flight delays.
Kind of fascinating that Reagan National was specifically named just weeks before the crash in testimony about telecommunications infrastructure. Because while we don't know much at this point about the crash, we do know that communications were an issue in that crash. Because air traffic control saw the military helicopter and told it to avoid the American Airlines flight 30 seconds before the crash, which should have been more than enough warning. And so, the telecommunications infrastructure, despite its old copper wires, it does appear that that system was working because air traffic control was seeing what was happening in real time, and the pilots were communicated at least to. But these old wires could create a scenario during which air traffic at Reagan National and many other places is not able to be seen in real time, and pilots are not able to be communicated with. And this is not a new problem. And it was known, and yet Congress still decided to increase the number of planes that are landing at Reagan last month, the airport they personally use most frequently to get home. Ugh. And it's not just the copper-wired telecommunication systems which need upgrading. Here's Dean Acapelli again, the Chief of Staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
We have radar sites right now that the FAA is going around trying to decommission because they don't have the means by which they can maintain it. That is not improving safety. That is simply a matter of taking down a radar site so you can use those parts someplace else because they don't have the means by which to maintain those radar sites. And that's another big issue we're going through.
So much work is needed on the air traffic controller system. Clearly, it's not just staffing. But even if air traffic control were fully staffed and the equipment brand new, there is still a major problem that is directly relevant to the Washington, D.C. airspace and this crash between a military Black Hawk helicopter and a passenger plane. Here's Kevin Walsh, the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the Government Accountability Office, testifying at the end of the hearing, which is the part of these hearings when witnesses tend to stop being polite and start getting real.
So I think the National Airspace System Safety Review Team did a great job in their recent report on the topic, and I would highlight some of the things that they said. In particular, it's very difficult right now to turn off the legacy systems once you have built the new system that is intended to replace it. We have a lot of users, in particular, if you read between the lines, the military, that does not easily transition over to newer technology, and FAA is then left holding the bag with two systems rather than one. And then they have to sustain both of those systems rather than focusing entirely on their new system, which again takes up an increasingly large piece of the not growing pie. So I think as our air traffic controllers, our pilots, and our technicians work with these older systems, it makes their life harder. And again, it makes it more upon them to catch things when they go wrong or when these systems have outages.
It is possible that the military helicopter and the passenger planes were communicating on two different systems. And I have no doubt that Jennifer Homendy, who's the chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, who we love here on Congressional Dish, and who is still on the job, by the way, I have no doubt that she will be investigating that communications gap. And she will tell us if the fact that the military communicates on a separate system because they don't want to upgrade their equipment played a role in this crash. Because if you watch the videos of that crash, there's no wobbling by that helicopter before the crash. There's no indication whatsoever that they ever saw the plane, despite being warned by air traffic control with plenty of time. And so this was preventable. And so here we are. What can we do about all this? Well, for starters, we can remember that everyone in government works for us. And so we have the right, in fact, the duty, to make our demands. And maybe you have some demands in your head already from what you've already heard today. Great. Call Congress and tell them. But here are a few more that I think could also be particularly helpful. So one demand that I'm going to make is that we need to demand Congress to force the military and the airlines to install the corresponding equipment to make sure they're working properly with air traffic control. Because it's not just the military that isn't doing the upgrades needed to make sure the air traffic control upgrades actually work. Here's Captain Jason Ambrosi. He's the president of the Airline Pilots Association.
One of the biggest modernization initiatives in recent history is NextGen. The capabilities that have been implemented with NextGen have increased situational awareness and provided tools to help pilots make safe decisions through performance-based navigation, data communication, and ADS-B implementation. However, the system's potential isn't being fully realized, in part because many airliners aren't properly equipped to take advantage of these updated capabilities. As a result, pilots and air traffic controllers are forced to use workarounds that allow us to operate aircraft with outdated equipment in today's complex system, all of which runs counter to the anticipated benefits of NextGen. Implementing communications, navigation, and surveillance with air traffic management, data communication systems, and ATC automation systems will allow controllers to monitor aircraft, improve communication between pilots and controllers for clearance and reroutes, and ensure aircraft line up on the correct runway.
Also in regards to equipment, we could demand that Congress force whoever President Trump's FAA administrator is eventually going to be to allow the air traffic controllers to pick their own equipment. Because this is what's happening now. So here's Dean Acapelli again. He's the chief of staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association. And in this clip, he's speaking to Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. And he's going to use some abbreviations. And so you should know that ATO stands for Air Traffic Organization. NAS stands for NAS, the National Airspace System. And NATCA is the abbreviation for National Air Traffic Controller Association.
We recently met with the COO of the ATO. And we talked about these equipment. Right now, the way it's set up is, unfortunately, that there's a program office that goes out and looks for and acquires new technologies. Then they take that equipment idea and bring it over to the ATO and say, hey, we've acquired this. How do you want to use it? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. We would rather, as the experts in running the air traffic control system, and the COO, Tim Morrell, has agreed, we should get together, talk about what do we need, look at all of the systems that are out there, prioritize what we need, prioritize what would make it better, go through that and move forward together and saying this is what the ATO needs, this is what air traffic control needs to maintain the safety of the NAS and improve and increase the efficiency of the NAS.
So what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Is there anything that prevents the FAA from doing that now?
There is not, and it is a goal that we're going to start doing in the coming weeks and months, certainly in 2025, to move, and this is not a NAC issue, it's an FAA issue, moving those pieces around to put the office that goes out and acquires technology under the ATO, for air traffic control under the ATO, so that we're acquiring systems that make sense to air traffic control.
And a part of this problem is also existing privatization. Once again proving that depending on the private sector for everything, contrary to the free market fundamentalism plaguing this country, is not always the best course of action, and there are consequences being felt here already. So here's Mark Scribner. He is the Senior Transportation Policy Analyst for the Reason Foundation, which, by the way, is an organization that is staffed with lots of apostles of the free market religion. And so if someone from Reason is saying this,
I think especially stakeholders who have contractors who have worked abroad with air navigation service providers outside the country, and then they come back and work with ATO, can see the night and day situation when it comes to technology procurement and technology development. A lot of some of the larger ANSPs globally are able to develop their own technology effectively in-house and then market it globally. That is something that the FAA used to specialize in developing technology in-house, but increasingly it's relying too much on outside contractors without adequate internal controls, and that is helping add to the delays and cost overruns for a variety of systems.
That is a recommendation to invest in government. At the same time that now President Donald Trump and his billionaire buddy Elon Musk and all of their friends are in the process of burning our government to the ground. And so we do need a Congress that's going to fight for a functional government, and we're going to have to fight them to get it. And so continuing with our optional marching orders, another demand we can make is for Congress to force all of the agencies to install the equipment that we buy in a timely manner. And here's some proof that Congress can do this via the laws they write. Here's Dave Sparrow again, the national president at the Professional Aviation Safety Specialists Division of the AFL-CIO, which again is the labor union for the techs who keep using Scotch tape and Elmer's glue to keep our aviation infrastructure from falling apart.
Passed thanks to lawmakers for including language in the 2024 reauthorization bill directing the agency to install 15 instrument landing systems that are in storage in Missouri. Past represented technicians are ready and capable of doing this. While the language in the reauthorization directs FAA to install the ILS within 18 months of the law's passage, our attempts to coordinate with the agency have gone unreturned. As far as PASS knows, the equipment, paid for by taxpayers, is still not in service.
And so on top of installing what we've already paid for, there's also more equipment that we need to buy, and here's one specific type of equipment that we can lobby to get installed nationwide. Here's Dean Acapelli again, the Chief of Staff at the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
We did deploy the Surface Awareness Initiative, and I know several times Austin was brought up. That was the first location that we worked with the FAA, and we collaboratively developed this new tool. Again, we call it the Surface Awareness Initiative. And we deployed it at Austin first, and we put it in 7 other locations. It is overwhelmingly positively received. In fact, we went out, the leadership of the FAA, including Administrator Whitaker from the ATO and NACA, went to Austin, talked to the folks there, and they're very appreciative, and it has made a difference. And we are continuing to we're continuing with our deployment schedule to get that out. It's in 8 facilities now. We're going to another 9 facilities in the coming months. So it has made a difference. And this is an interesting point between those things that are modernization that are for safety and those things that are modernization for capacity. The TFDM is more a capacity tool. All things that we make better, modernize, have some effect on safety. But the Surface Awareness Initiative is a direct tool that directly affects safety.
And I get that the airlines want them focused on capacity and that our government lately really just serves the corporations more than us. But I want the tools first that prioritize safety. And so the Surface Awareness Initiative, let's go. But obviously, all of this will take money, and the amount of money that gets appropriated is determined by how much is requested. And funding the requests in full doesn't appear to be a problem. Here's Dean Acapelli, the Chief of Staff of the National Air Traffic Controller Association.
Congress has consistently provided the FAA with the resources it requests through both authorization of top-line numbers and the annual appropriations process.
Hey, look at that. Congress did a thing right. But are the requests accurate? Here's Captain Jason Ambrosi, the president of the Airline Pilots Association.
Unfortunately, underinvestment, including for facilities and equipment account, is affecting the systems pilots and air traffic controllers use to ensure safe and efficient operations. While Congress has provided the funding requested each year by the FAA during the annual appropriations process, there remains a significant shortfall in numerous maintenance and modernization efforts. Resources have not kept up with inflation and effectively require the agency to prioritize sustainment to the detriment of modernization and infrastructure needs. The FAA must ask Congress for its true needs in order to sustain the legacy systems and make greater headway on NextGen to improve the NAS for pilots and all users.
And that was before the government wrecking balls arrived in D.C. From here on forward, it's going to be the Trump people making their requests. And we don't even know who the Trump people at the FAA are going to be yet. And that's not entirely Trump's fault, because the FAA administrator, Michael Whitaker, who we were introduced to in the Boeing episodes after he was confirmed by the Senate for a 5-year term in October 2023, well, he resigned on January 20th on Trump's inauguration day. Now, this is actually something that's becoming fairly well known, and Elon Musk has been widely blamed for Michael Whitaker's resignation because Elon Musk publicly called for his resignation many times, which many people, myself included, think was motivated by Elon Musk being pissed that the FAA was doing its job and policing SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, during Whitaker's tenure, because the FAA fined SpaceX $600,000 for launching space missions with unapproved changes from their original submitted plans. But the reality is that Michael Whitaker didn't have to resign. There are a lot of people who didn't have to resign. It's a weird custom that so many heads of agencies resign simply because a new administration has begun, a custom that leaves our agencies leaderless for a few weeks or even months while a new administration sorts out its appointments. Whitaker could have stayed until someone new was in that position or forced President Trump to fire him. At some point, and I think we've passed it, we need to throw out the norm of heads of agencies being linked to the political parties who appointed them. If Michael Whitaker was qualified to serve as FAA administrator during Biden's presidency, which he seemed to be, then he was qualified to keep serving until Trump replaced him, if Trump even intended to replace him. But instead, the position of FAA administrator was vacant on January 29th, the day of the crash. And I think Michael Whitaker deserves some blame for that. But of course, so does President Trump. Because Trump didn't bother to nominate someone to be confirmed by the Senate as the new FAA administration. He still hasn't. And even worse, he didn't appoint anyone to serve as the acting FAA administrator in the meantime. The FAA administrator job, for no good reason at all, was vacant on January 29th, the day of the crash. Now, Trump quickly appointed an acting FAA director right after the crash, and I guess just hoped no one would notice. And honestly, the media has been too busy being outraged, so outraged, that he said more stupid shit about DEI hires to pay attention to the actual staffing. I hate how many people report more on what Trump says than what Trump does. But I noticed his actions matter more than his words, and in this case, his lack of action left an important position simply vacant. Now, obviously, we don't know how much this mattered. Would it have made a difference if someone had been in charge of the FAA that day? Like, did Whitaker's resignation and that vacancy cause some kind of stoppage of accountability that led to not normal staffing decisions at Reagan National on Wednesday night? We don't know. But this is the type of ripple effect problem that can happen when our government isn't properly staffed. No one in charge leads to leadership gaps, which sometimes leads to one employee having to do the jobs of two people. It leads to the people on the job using Scotch tape and Elmer's glue to try to keep our essential services functional during chaos. And in our government this month, it's clearly intentional chaos. And now that the Republicans are back in charge and are clearly hell-bent on gutting our government, as usual, I want to address something that hasn't happened yet in this Trump era, but did happen in the last one, and so I want us to be prepared. Because in the last Trump administration, there was an effort to privatize the air traffic control system. Because Republicans, or at least some of them anyway, have wanted to privatize air traffic control since 1995. And I produced a whole episode about this in 2017, and that is in the show notes for you. It was called Episode 152, Air Traffic Control Privatization. And so listen to the episode to hear the debate that happened in the first year of the last Trump administration and learn multiple reasons why privatizing air traffic control is a bad idea. But that effort has happened because there are actual systemic problems within our air traffic control system. The main one being that the FAA, the Air Traffic Control Police, is also in charge of air traffic control. We have a situation where an agency is essentially regulating itself, and clearly that's not going well. And since privatization of every service that could possibly be done for a profit, no matter how essential, is the goal of a significant number of Republicans in Congress, I would not be surprised to see this idea get zombied again. But there is a better model that is working beautifully all over the world. So here's Mark Scribner again, the Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at the Reason Foundation.
The ATO's institutional design was historically the dominant model for air navigation service providers globally. This picture has changed dramatically since 1987, when New Zealand became the first country to separate air traffic control from its transport ministry. Since then, nearly all industrialized countries have adopted a public utility model for air traffic control, and separating the provision of air navigation services from the Civil Aviation Authority has been a globally recognized best practice by the International Civil Aviation Organization for more than 2 decades. This organizational separation allows air traffic control to be regulated at arm's length, just like every other aviation player. And it resolves the fundamental conflict of interest of having a regulator also operate a service that it is tasked with regulating. Under the public utility model, air navigation service providers assess cost-based user fees paid directly to the providers. Providers can then issue revenue bonds based on their projected revenue streams, just as airports do today in the United States. It is through predictable user-based revenue collection that air navigation service providers outside the U.S. have been able to successfully finance large-scale capital modernization efforts. Air navigation service providers that operate as public utilities funded by user fees now number 62 and serve 83 countries worldwide. In contrast, just 18 countries besides the United States, mostly developing countries, continue to operate air traffic control as part of legacy civil aeronautics authorities that also regulate aviation safety. The modernization of existing air traffic management infrastructure in the United States continues to fall behind peer countries and is straining from the continued operations and growth of conventional airspace users. The prospect of new airspace entrants raises even more questions about the ability of the U.S. to accommodate the future of aviation. The bottom line is this: successfully modernizing air traffic control technology and service provision in this country will require institutional modernization.
And so that is an actionable solution to the problem that privatization is often suggested as a way to solve. Now, the real reason for privatization is that some fucking contractor would probably get to siphon off tax money and stuff it into their investors' pockets. It's like, hey, why not let SpaceX control our airspace? They already function like NASA, so let's just let Elon Musk profit from everything. So we have to watch out for that. But there's also airlines who would love to get the ability to decide where planes get to land and how often, and lock out any possible competition from having the ability to land on the runways. And so the public utility model, I like it, and one of the reasons is in the name. It keeps this essential government service in the public domain, and it's been demonstrated to work all over the world. And so if in the next few weeks the privatization zombie returns, we can shoot it dead with this reasonable, actionable suggestion. Because when calling Congress, expressing anger is one thing, but offering a solution, that is infinitely better. And today we heard a lot of solutions. 202-224-3121 is the number to call to be connected to your members of Congress. Again, that's 202-224-3121. And if you were in any way affected by this preventative tragedy, I am so sorry for your loss. Hopefully, armed with this information, we can bully our Congress into doing what needs to be done to prevent this from ever happening again. Now, if you liked this episode and you think it needs to be heard widely in the United States, I have 2 requests for you. The first one is the most important. Please share this podcast. I have been very, very bad about marketing Congressional Dish for a lot of years, and I do need your help. And this is one that I feel like anyone who flies in the United States should probably hear. So please share this episode widely. And then also, if you are supporting Congressional Dish, thank you for doing so. But this one could use some executive producer credits, because executive producer credits move these episodes up on the most valuable episodes list of Congressional Dish, which is where I send every single new person when they ask me, where should I go in the back catalog? What should I listen to first? Because we've now done 310 of these, and a lot of them are important. And so I leave it up to the producers to decide what moves to the top of that list. And so I would like to thank John Riccio, who put an executive producer credit on episode 307, Immaculate Constellation. So that was also about flying things, specifically unidentified flying things. And that was a fun, I find all of those episodes fascinating. So thank you for moving that one up the list. But this episode is one that I also would love to see move up the list. And so even if you're not interested in the private feed, which is fine, you don't need to listen to Last Week in Congress. If you're not interested in that, you can still support the show with Zells and Venmos and paper checks and all of those methods. And all of those donations count towards your executive producer credits. And thank you to everyone who's still supporting the show. And before I wrap this episode up, I do have one more ask of you while we are writing down phone numbers and acting on the stuff we heard on Congressional Dish. And this one has to do with C-SPAN. So I'm a little pissed off right now at Google because they are the owners of YouTube TV. And I have had YouTube TV mainly to watch live sports. But YouTube TV, now that football season is over, is increasing its prices to $82, which matches all of the live TV streaming services, which seem to be colluding on prices because they're all settling on $82. But I have been paying Google via YouTube TV. I'm not giving them $82. I'm canceling that service. And one of the reasons that I'm canceling their service is that they refuse to include C-SPAN in their lineup. And this hearing that I played for you today, I know C-SPAN was there to cover it because I saw Howard Mortman, the communications director of C-SPAN. He had clips from it all over his Twitter today. So C-SPAN was there. And what that means is that if C-SPAN were in these lineups, while just scrolling through the channels, you could happen upon that hearing. I mean, that's really how I started Congressional Dish, is that I was just clicking around and sometimes I would land on C-SPAN and be like, wow, this is interesting stuff. It would be either a hearing or a House floor debate or a Senate floor debate. But that can't happen if C-SPAN just isn't included in the lineup. And here's what makes me absolutely bonkers. You guys probably know at this point that I've become friends with the people at C-SPAN. And so I know for a fact that Google and the other networks, so like Hulu, Fubo, all of these non-cable live TV providers that don't include C-SPAN and are charging $82, they can include all three of C-SPAN's channels for 7 cents. They're charging $82 and they can't afford 7 cents for C-SPAN. And this is something that I am grateful to say that Congress is finally getting involved in because it is making it harder for our country to be informed. And so I'm thrilled to tell you that Senator Ron Wyden, who's a Democratic senator out of Oregon, and Representative Mike Flood, who is a Republican out of Nebraska, they together sent a letter not just to YouTube TV, aka Google, but also to Fubo and Hulu, telling them that they should be offering the C-SPAN networks in their lineups. They said in their letter, quote, "As greater numbers of Americans cut the cord and migrate from cable to streaming services, it is vital that C-SPAN's nonpartisan coverage of Congress and the White House continue to be accessible," unquote. And I absolutely agree with that. But what that means is that these companies, Google, Hulu, which is Disney, Fubo, all of these companies are now getting pressured by Congress. I think it's a good time for them to be pressured by their customers too. And so what I'm asking you to do is to lend a hand. Let's help Congress with their efforts by calling these customer service lines and letting them know that they can afford the 7 cents for all three C-SPAN channels. And so get your pencils back out. Here are the customer service lines for all three of those streaming services. Let's start with Google's YouTube TV. The phone number is 833-389-2054. Let's also give a call to Disney's Hulu at 888-265-6650. And while we're at it, let's give Fubo a call at 844-551-1005. And thank you if you are willing to do this, because I want to watch C-SPAN on TV. I think it's good for all of us. So yeah, and if we had C-SPAN, this, like I said, this was aired on December 12th. And so this information, which feels like a revelation to hear all of this information about air traffic control, if more Americans had the ability to see this and were enraged, I don't know, a month ago, maybe the staffing could have been different. I don't know. But having this information hidden from the public, it's not good. It's just not good. So thank you again for listening to the show. Thank you especially for sharing the show, and thank you for supporting it. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to do this episode, so I'm going to get back to the episodes I was planning for you. But yeah, thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We
don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.